Yes, a very good evening, everyone, from a very sunny and warm southwest France. It's nice to see you all. I was just saying to Joanne, this is a suitable follow-up topic from last week when I spoke from Florence, when we had an interview with Stefan Alex about his book, When I Was Someone Else. And this raised an awful lot of interesting questions about identity, time, lived experience, whether everything is in fact in the present in a certain sense. So we had a very, very interesting discussion. So those of you who are members who haven't seen, weren't at that meeting, I recommend that you go back and have a look at it. Anyway, this evening will be very interesting indeed. I think it's around this book here, Afterlives, by Joanne Helfrich, and it contains a fascinating and intriguing range of communicators or characters, and each of whom has a very distinctive voice. And so if you were to compare what each of them had to say and the way they said it and the angles they were coming from, you couldn't help concluding that these are very distinctive individualities. And so someone like Martin Luther King or Thomas Paine or Goethe, Jung, Yogananda, even George Harrison, who got here, and Aldous Huxley, and interestingly, Jane Roberts, who is famous for her Seth books. And we've got Chris Johnson on the call this evening, who's a specialist in Seth, I noticed. In fact, there seem to be two Chris Johnsons, but maybe it's the same person. We'll find out. Anyway, Joanne is coming in to us from the West Coast, I think. She'll correct me if I'm wrong. So she'll tell us a little bit about how this book came about and what people shared and what we can learn from this source of communication, which is of use to us at the coalface, as it were. And so she has her own platform called New World View, which provides educational programs exploring practical applications of conscious creation, so co-creation of reality. And she comes from Topanga in California. So Joanne, what a pleasure to see you here, and over to you.
Why, thank you so much, David. And I'm just so delighted to be here today. I've been a member of SMN for a long time now, SNMN, sorry. And I'm just so happy to be in this group because I feel like I've been working towards being in your company, and I'm just so happy to finally be here. So thank you so much for being here today with me. I'm going to be sharing some slides and telling you a little bit about my background, just a little bit, because that has to do with how the book was created. And mostly I'm going to be sharing the author's accounts, which I think is the best part of the whole story. So I will go ahead and share my slides. Okay, let me see here. All right. So this is me. I was really rocking this beautiful rain hat, and the way I button my coat is similar to the way I button my coat today. So some things never change. People ask me if I had any signs of psychic ability when I was little, and no, not that I remember or that anyone has told me. However, I was always sensitive, emotional, conceptual, artistic, with a great love of music, and I still am. And the reason I mention this is because I really wonder how many people who, like me, are sort of more in touch with or use their inner senses more, have more aptitude towards developing, or capacity maybe towards developing these abilities. So I think that's worth exploring. Maybe someone is already. But I do remember when I was no older than 5, having an existential experience. I knew exactly where I was standing. It was in the kitchen of the home we lived in, and everything sort of slowed down. And I just wondered why. Why is all this reality here? Do I exist, or am I the only one who exists, perhaps? And what is the point? What is the purpose of all of it? Am I alone in the universe, or whatever this reality is? And is this some kind of an experiment, perhaps, to find out maybe whether or not I will be a good person? I was raised Catholic, so I was already getting these moral messages about being good. And I thought, well, maybe this is some kind of a test to find out how good I will be. And I know it probably sounds unusual to have a 5-year-old, a memory from when I was 5 years old. But I just wonder how many children do. I do remember it very clearly. And also, what's in that bag? So this is really a key to who I am now, because it does also have something to do with the book. It's this idea of intent, our soul's designed for fulfillment. It's what we were born to do or to explore in our lives. And we come in with it when we're children, when we're born. And I believe, and I will be teaching a course starting in the fall on how to find one's own intent and also their purpose in life. And I believe that all of us display signs of our life intent, our soul intent, as young children. And for me, it's in that bag, sort of, because every Thursday I would beg my mother to give me something to take to show and tell for my kindergarten. And every time she would give me something, I just enjoyed that so much. Even though I was shy, I enjoyed showing and telling. And here I am today, showing and telling what I know. And so I think that's very pertinent to this conversation, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a bit. But for many years, there were no esoteric works available to me. So Catholicism wasn't for me. There were some good messages in it, but even at an early age, I was skeptical about some of the more dogmatic messages that were taught to us. And so it took a couple of decades almost for me to find what I needed to find as far as wisdom teachings. So in 1985, when I was in my 20s, I discovered the book Seth Speaks. And it was written by Jane Roberts, who channeled Seth. And here she is channeling Seth with her husband, Rob Butts, who transcribed everything by hand and through the typewriter before the books were sent off to be published. She channeled the Seth material, as it's called, from late 1963 until her death in 1984. The books were instrumental in bringing the idea of channeling to a wide audience. Seth described himself as an energy personality essence, a vast collective energy who also had physical lifetimes, or has physical lifetimes in the eternal now, you might say. So there were over 40 books written by Seth and Jane. The core ideas include the idea that consciousness creates matter, that each individual creates his or her own reality through their thoughts, beliefs, emotions, and expectations. And Seth encourages us to live up to our abilities of consciousness. And Jane also wrote 3 worldview books from people in the afterlife: Rembrandt, Paul Cézanne, and William James. And she called these worldviews because she described them as blueprints of who they are, who are sort of deposited, like an energy deposit that remains sort of the same, but it's who can be informed by other energies, wider energies. And so she didn't claim to be speaking with them directly, but to their worldviews. And these might also be explained as Akashic records. And I met my future husband and Seth scholar, Paul Helfrich, a couple of years later. And on the 3rd date, he confessed to me that he loved the Seth material and was almost half afraid to tell me because he was afraid he might scare me. He wasn't sure how I would take it. But fortunately, I had read Seth Speaks and I thought it was great. So the rest is history. We've spent over 30 years exploring channeling and psychology. Paul wrote the book Seth, the Ultimate Guide, which is a compilation of the 40 or more books of Jane and Seth's. And it is not in print now, but it did turn into our online course, Seth Revealed. And this is now available on demand. And if you're interested, it's very thorough and it is very comprehensive. And I will be sharing the link if you're interested in that at the end of this presentation. Also, we created the website, the Elias Forum. We found another channeler who expanded the ideas of Seth, named Elias, channeled by Mary Ennis. So that is available also, eliasforum.org. And also we supported the work of Serge Granbois, who still channels Chris, K-R-I-S. We had something called Dinner and a Dead Guy, Eat, Drink, Think, and where Serge would have people over at his house, we'd have people over at our house, we would have dinner and drinks, and then we would have a Chris session, and it was a lot of fun. And during this time, I think it's important to note too that we developed a sense of irreverence about it and fun about all of this because the concepts were so deep, and there always has been a great deal of respect for the work, but it was also important to have fun with it. And that was an important part of all this. Also, we became students of Don Beck and Ken Wilber. Don Beck, who unfortunately just passed last week. It was very sad. I'm really grateful to have been his student. I learned this directly from Don, and of course Ken Wilber, who included Don's stage development model in his theory of everything. And these two people really gave us a lot of maturity with regard to this information, because we became grounded in the psychology of this information. You know, people are always going to interpret wisdom teachings according to their stage of development. And this became invaluable to us as we continued our own work. And these are great books to get, by the way, and A Theory of Everything, the one with the red red cover here, I think is the best one. So I have always been drawn to helping people discover their intent. All three channeled sources that we studied, Seth, Elias, and Chris, used a typology to help people connect with their intent, their soul's designed for expression. And when I say intent, I mean something a little bit different than intention. You know, it was my intention to do this or that. It was my, the way we use it in everyday life. This is really our deep sense of calling and where we want to put our energies. Some people try to create a self-test so that we, while we were always encouraged to use our inner senses to find out our intent or the intent of our family members, to do our own little readings, because that was always the thing for us to sort of develop our own inner sources. We weren't able to create a self-test. We had to keep going back to the gurus to double check to see if we were right. And we wanted more autonomy to be able to do this. In March 2007, Paul and I went to an Integral Institute workshop, and I noticed that even though people were very well versed with Ken Wilber's work, excuse me, and Don Beck's, they seemed to be having trouble with finding ways to make this information practical in their lives. The life coaches seemed to not have a problem with that, but other people did. These were often retired people who had the time to study this information that really didn't know, I think, where to go with it. And so I came home from that workshop determined to figure out how to do this, because I realized that the only way to do it, to discover a person's intent, including our own, was to divine it. So I amended my Ouija board with colored dots representing the 9 families of consciousness, or 9 families of intent. Seth calls them pools of consciousness, but they all have the same names. I mean, that's what's, I think, especially incredible, is that even though they were coming from 3 different channeled sources, they all had the same unique names, all 9 of them spelled uniquely. Anyway, so I amended my Ouija board with the color dots, and I sat with a lifeless planchette for about 10 days. It was excruciating because I've never been good at using the Ouija board, and I had limited success with someone, doing it at the same time. But I had never been able to do it on my own. And I sat there day after day for about an hour, and I was having trouble really getting how to do that. And then one day, just about a yard from my ear, there was a child's voice said, "Let's just play." Now, we don't have children. They were probably neighborhood kids. And I wouldn't call this necessarily an angelic intervention, but it sure felt like one, even though it was a physical child. I think that's how angels work, probably. And that's all I needed to loosen up. And when I was creating this slide, it occurred to me that is the perfect example. I had the perfect ingredients for discovering this, because I came in with a sincere desire to help people, but also I needed to loosen up and had fun. And so these are characteristics of intent that are super, super important to discover. So Rose came through in just about 10 days later. The colored dots became letters, then words, then paragraphs. And then I was busily handwriting. And I moved to the keyboard, and I would key, and then Ouija on my lap, and then key, and then Ouija on my lap. And then Rose came through, this energy that I was already sort of familiar with. And she taught me to autotype. She encouraged me to put my fingers on the keys and just sort of relax and let go. And I put my fingers on the QWERTY keyboard, and she moved each of them across the keyboard as if she was teaching me to type for the first time, in a very regular kind of way, all the way across. And then the next day, I figured I could air type. I happen to know what the letters are in my head when I use my fingers to sort of type in the air. Rose describes herself the same way Seth did, as an energy personality essence. She has no physical lifetimes, but she is connected with many millions of physical lifetimes. And of course, in this realm, our pronouns fall apart. There's many genders, but we have always gone with the pronoun she. Her objective is to help us realize our direct connection with our own essence, and find and live our intent and our own way of channeling. What kind of expressions do we all have? She's written 2 books, The Way of Spirit, Teachings of Rose, and Let That Shit Go, Learn to Process Loss and Be Happy, and excuse my French. And it is a grief book. It is a very small book to teach us how to process anything from small losses to large ones. And then I learned rather accidentally that I was able to speak with non-physical people. I read a book about, actually the way I discovered it was that I was having a private session with someone, a Rose private session. And this client asked to speak to her mother, who happened to have passed. And so Rose came through with that information, even though I didn't know I could do that. And then I read a book some years later about J.D. Salinger, the American author, and I loved him, and I didn't want to leave his company. And so he wrote through me The Afterlife of J.D. Salinger. And Rose also has a website at thewayofspirit.com. So, and I have to tell you, so Dave Coverly writes a syndicated comic and called Speed Bump, and he just has the perfect comics for my presentation. So I'm going to be including some of these just to keep things light. And I'm also going to be reading a lot of text. So you're welcome to close your eyes, and you might think of this as a lecture only with cartoons. Okay, so whatever works, eyes open, eyes closed, either one is fine. So I had experimented a bit with channeling specific people, and in 2018, tried again after Anthony Bourdain committed suicide. Now, Anthony Bourdain is an American chef and travel host. He had his own TV show, and he was loved by millions. And he was, to, anyone's judgment, a successful, well-loved person. And so his suicide really shocked us. So I tried to connect with Anthony, and I did pretty well. I posted it on my blog and wanted to find out what other people thought about it. And what had prevented me until now is that I've always been very skeptical about my work. I have not wanted to release it until I was sure that it was right. So people really connected with it. And so I decided, well, maybe I'll try that again sometime, but I really didn't until over a year later, actually almost 2 years later. It was around 4 a.m. and I woke up with the idea that I wanted to talk to American journalist and novelist Hunter S. Thompson. And I got up a few hours later and I did, and it turned out really well also. And then I thought, well, I'll try again, Now, by this time, we were in COVID lockdown. And so I thought, well, I don't really have anything better to do. I'll just give this a shot. And so I would just, get a transcript and from my channeling, one of them, and I would read it to my husband and nephew and his dog after dinner, because, we were in lockdown and they were the only ones who were able to come over to be with Paul and I. And it just became sort of after dinner entertainment. So it was, it was a lot of fun. And so, so Ayn Rand came through. I had tried to speak with her previously, and then, I thought I'd try her again. And Ayn, of course, was a Russian-American novelist and also a zealous materialist. And so wasn't she surprised, right? And she just didn't want to stop. There was sort of an unspoken agreement that, that they would do sort of a chapter's worth. But she wanted to keep going, and she wanted me to do a book right away, which is really funny because that's exactly how she was when physical, and her books were thick. And she said, she mentioned Hunter, who did the chapter, when it became a book, it became the chapter before hers. She said, he's wanting for me to mention now too, that he's looking to talk to you again. And I thought, well, that's really interesting, because up until now, I'd assumed that they had something better to do than to talk to me, right? If you're in the afterlife, then you have all kinds of things to do. Why would you want to, talk to me? You don't even know me. So I went back and talked to Hunter again, and he said, there are others here like me, writers who want to talk to you too. However, they want to be asked first. So that really knocked me for a loop, because all of a sudden this turned into something that required my intense scrutiny and sense of responsibility. So by now I realized that this needed to be a book, but who should I ask to come through? Because everyone I had asked to come through had so far, to the best of my knowledge, that it was them. And what would they say? Because the questions are important. We ask and you shall receive, right? The questions are important to create the framework to get the information that we're seeking. So I asked that the most helpful book be written, and I set a psychic invitation for each author to provide a chapter. And I asked that the authors collaborate as a committee to ensure flow and a valuable reading experience. I really did not want to have to edit a lot of chapters. I felt that that would be absolutely daunting to try to do that. So I asked that, it just be a book of chapters. I would create some connective tissue words in between, and that the whole thing would make sense to the reader in the best way possible for the reader. So according to Rose, and the reason why it worked is that the authors and I share the intent to help bring what's needed into the world now with regard to our own lives' intents. So that's the intent again. For this continues even after we're dead. So that's how important our intent is, according to Jane, or according to Rose. So why me? Right? Why not someone who is more experienced than I? Because I had just started doing this. And this is what George Harrison says in the book. I understand the reasons for you to be doing this work because you want to help others. So that's sort of intention, right? That's my intention, to help others. There's not any reason for me to speak with anybody else who, for example, may think differently. I wouldn't support that. I wouldn't come through somebody with an agenda of just making money. That's not what I was about, and it's not what I'm about now. You and I have the ability to connect this way because our clouds of potentials of what we'd love to consider connect first, then pull us together like pieces of a puzzle. And I think that's just such a wonderful description of intent and how it pulls us together, not just between a human and someone who's physical and someone in the afterlife, but all of us two together, all of us here together are pulled together through our soul's intent. And I just think that's such a beautiful thing. The process is that, and this is described by Jane Roberts, who wrote the introduction for the book and the final chapter. She says, I engage with the committee of authors, and we help put things together for her, acting collaboratively before she even gets to the typewriter or keyboard, as you call it these days. I also help with translations from others who have gone past their immediate after-death environment. Those still in the after-death environment are readily accessible by Joanne. Those that go beyond have already helped themselves heal from past traumas, relive some lives or experiences, then gone on to other things, new lifetimes, for example. The way to view them, therefore, is as they were in a kind of blueprint or worldview state, as she would call it, that captures who they were when alive without needing update in a sense. They are informed by the next level of consciousness. Therefore, the best information relating to each person is available with my help and others. So one of the most poignant things that was said in the book is from someone named John Barron, who I'll talk about a little bit. He was really special. I was asking for people to come through, and everyone who I asked to come through was coming through. And then for some reason, I had the idea that I should just ask whoever should be writing the next chapter to come through. I didn't want to limit it. And John Barron describes himself as a 16th century Scottish slaver who, I don't even know if he would exist in any historical record. I haven't looked him up. It would be interesting. But he's someone who would never, he says, have been able to tell his story if I hadn't asked for that perspective without even knowing who he was. Never heard of him. And so that really speaks to this idea of the worldview, the blueprint, the energetic deposit, the version of ourselves that remains. So everything that has existed, we have reason to believe will continue to exist. Forever, perhaps. Here are the authors, Anthony Bourdain, Hunter S. Thompson, and Ayn Rand, who we spoke about, or I spoke about, Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights leader, American civil rights leader, Harriet Tubman, who is also a social justice leader and abolitionist in this country, John Barron, who I just mentioned, Thomas Paine, who is a British-born writer and was one of the main provocateurs of that helped establish the American Revolution, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, I'm sure who you know, German scientist, author, polymath. Albert Einstein needs no description. Carl Jung, Hildegard von Bingen, 12th century nun, Paramahansa Yogananda, of course, and J.D. Salinger, American novelist, George Harrison, Beatle, and musician, producer, Douglas Adams, British novelist, James Baldwin, American novelist, Kurt Vonnegut, American novelist, Aldous Huxley, British novelist, Robin Williams, American actor and comic, and Jane Roberts. So David was kind enough to read my manuscript before it got published, and he sent it to another person who I now also consider an angel. Oh, sorry. I don't know how to turn that off. Professor Lance Butler, who is the director of the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle Center in Edinburgh. And Lance is also a former literary stylistics expert at the University of Edinburgh. And he had these wonderful words to say that were so encouraging.
It's been so interesting listening to you, because it's really something quite different, you know, that you're presenting. I mean, we know a lot, I think, here about mediumship and psychics and so on, and there's a great deal of material, but this moves it to a different plane, I think. And also you've had some extraordinary experiences which most of us haven't got. But I'd like to start the ball rolling, Joanne, by just, for this short Q&A, just to say, you very kindly, perhaps people don't know this, you very kindly sent a virtual copy, and you know, an attachment to an email, your entire book to us, and I read it. I read it with great fascination. Now, my entire career has been literary, and indeed stylistics and linguistic analysis of literature has been one of my special subjects. So I actually know what makes up the style of some people. I'm not an expert in all those people. For example, my notion of George Harrison's style was limited to the Beatles songs, obviously, you know, but some of those other people have very famous styles, very marked styles, and there's absolutely no doubt that either you're a fantastic genius at imitating the styles, you know, the great pastiche sort of queen of imitating the styles of literary and other writers, or you're getting it from somewhere else. And
yeah, I'm certainly not capable or brilliant enough to be able to write like that. You can ask anyone who knows me. I could never have written those myself.
I mean, it would be fantastically difficult to do. I mean, I tried to think about, you know, how I take a famous novelist, someone I know quite a lot about, like Thomas Hardy. You know, I've thought a lot about his style and so on. I try to write a paragraph like Thomas Hardy. I'm struggling, you know, and you could say I'm an expert. So this must be a very special thing.
Yeah, so that was a real shot in the arm. Whoops. So one of the main themes that many of the authors talk about is that we go as we are into the afterlife, and we continue much as we did. Anthony Bourdain said, who committed suicide, of course, afterwards, I was totally put off by what my body looked like when dead. I hadn't considered before that I would actually see myself. Hunter S. Thompson, who also committed suicide, I thought I might become non-physical, but I didn't know I would still be physical in the sense of my body really is my body. Jane Roberts, I woke up in my body. Even though I was dead, I was still feeling in my body. Hunter S. Thompson, I'm still recovering as a war correspondent of the world and will have more to say from my bed here in the Galaxy Hotel. Hunter, you know, was a journalist, so he would say something like that. Is a journalist still. Another main idea is that we create our own reality. Jane Roberts, of course, says you create your reality based on your beliefs. And Albert Einstein has a more scientific sounding description of this. He says, I have come to believe that the images you see are not exactly simply compressed matter or even the thinnest of wave energy. The images you see in our reality, that is, are focused upon in your brains, then carried forth into your view. Your expectation of something happening, for example, collapses the wave function into material-like particles that are not really material at all. They are energy patterns that express themselves in your reality based on the permissions of your physical construction. And so, when we talk about if consciousness is primary, we create our reality, then how is all this stuff organized? And the words divine order were mentioned by one of the authors. So I'm going to get to how there are areas of consciousness. But Einstein goes on to say that while the body has potentials that deem matter to be the most inviolate of particles in the universe, this was not ever my claim. The inviolate was always a matter of spirit, pardon the pun. Matter was never, therefore, the substrate of all things. When looking at the whole, the entirety of all things ever, you must first conclude that the reasons for all change in dimensions has to do foremost with there not being anything other than the universe in every single particle. Those particles are not real in the sense of matter. They are not even potentials. They are living beings brought about through the consciousness of one's soul. So how does this divine order, as they say, keep everything straight? Well, we had a few of the authors talk about that. Albert Einstein goes on to say, when you understand the ways or permissions of universal order, you will get the sense about how something can be permitted only in some ways, then realized in that sense, while also realizing other permissions elsewhere. Do you understand? Everything has connection. Everything has relevance within its own set of circumstances. I have permissions that reach into your world now the same way I did when I was physical. The permissions have many ways of being realized through telepathy, through physical constructions, through tonal patterns that exist subatomically. Hunter S. Thompson, being a journalist, says I had some kind of credentials to get to where I am now. Ayn Rand describes it this way. The areas of consciousness I'm in now are floors that reach through other floors into spaces of light and darkness, as well as tone, color, and other attributes not quite realized in earthly terms. These areas are inspired by our mental state, our spiritual state, our healing state. Each floor has multiple corridors that go on forever. The actual places are not this linear. They are more ideas that move one about in new ways all the time. Therefore, because of the chaos of this that I don't like very much, I have called this the protocol place. It extends forever too, so you can imagine why some individuals want to take some measure to live with some form. So she actually has or had discomfort getting used to this environment. She goes on to say that she actually had to create a protocol that when she put her foot forward and stepped, there would be a floor there to meet it. Healing and transcendence is talked about a lot. Jane Roberts says, who still believed to be, felt that she was in her body, said, I had to be awakened as I was sleeping. Those who woke me were angels, which I had imagined, of course, in my Catholic doctrines that I'd learned as a girl. The angels escorted me from my body into a kind of sanitarium, the old kind where you went to recover. The place was very enjoyable. There were doctors, nurses, and many kinds of other invalid types besides me who were caring and healing to be around. Anthony Bourdain, I was unprepared for what would follow, a sort of movement, though I wasn't physical, so I wasn't really moving, into a kind of rehab place. And Anthony Bourdain had a lot of problems with drugs, so he would create a rehab place, understandably. Martin Luther King Jr., the incorporation of healing for my body, what I took with me, which was in many ways still feeling the effects of my physical reality, is what I have most benefited from. Now, there was one author who says that she didn't really require any healing. And if you know Harriet Tubman, you can kind of understand why. She was amazing. She was like an angel on earth. She says, I died without sin. This helped the transition because I was able to abstain from many of the services that others required to heal, then to move into new journeys. My physical journey had done that. I had done the work that was required of me before I died, that many who did not achieve or attempt what I did had to in order to move along the path set for them by their loving Father. Okay, so this raised a question in my mind. So is the loving Father, is that the God, that we're all going to see in the afterlife? Is that the way it really works, even though we've had our doubts that God is a father? And she said that it doesn't matter if you want to consider yourselves as having a father God, a mother God, or a chicken God. But what's important is that you have a sense of your own God that understands you, that you understand it. It's the personal connection that's the most important. Martin Luther King Jr. said, there are always people willing to achieve a sort of sainthood from the ashes of their physical lives. This happens here. This always happens here. If there are no other words to describe the ability for a saint to be born from sinner, it's this. The sinner has come to us out of his own jurisdiction and prudent association with goodness. In other words, each sinner has the ability as well as the primal urge towards goodness. I just find that it just feels so right to me because, I believe that if there is a God, God has to be goodness, right? And this seems to support that. Robin Williams says, the facts of heaven are that you go as you primarily, then you heal, then you become more than you. Now, there probably isn't a better example of the healing and transcendence than what John Barron provides. He's the one I mentioned earlier as the 16th century Scottish slaver. When he passed and he went into the afterlife, he was still his same old self. And he bragged about how his accomplishments, his sense of superiority over everybody, and he went on and on and on, and eventually the words just started echoing to him, and he realized what a horrible person he had been while he was physical. And this is what he says happened next. It dawned upon me like a day broke through night that the experiences I had had as a slaver would be forever beneficial if I could repent to do good, to learn from what I had done, to speak out, to share that I had not done well, that others might benefit. I took on the healing that was required. The punishment was not needed. I was punishing enough to myself. My inner life was sparked by something divine that told me that even the worst sinner can repent, and I did. I repented forever, it seemed, until one day I was able to not have to. I learned that doing goodness was my reward. I became a minister. I learned that doing goodness was my reward. I became a minister in another lifetime. I helped with the cause of the emancipation of slaves too. I had a deep and abiding love for the African people that I caused so much harm to. I let go of my feelings of superiority. I had not any reason to do this except for the sheer necessity of saving my own soul from the fires of hell, the hell of my own sin, the hell of my own conscience. And in this I found true grace. How's that for a testimonial of how we heal and transcend? So this, of course, speaks to this idea of greater selfhood, because we talked about the blueprint. I talked about the blueprint of who we are when we pass, how that remains, right? And then John Barron is talking about having been informed by his greater selfhood, how both of them are involved in this transmission in the book. And so this goes beyond the kind of ideas about selfhood that we've been taught. Of course, we've also been taught that we have this ego self. And then there's a sense of oneness. We want to achieve oneness. It's big in the Buddhist faith. You're one body, you're one soul, and you're quite likely to appreciate life more when you discover this. So this seems to be the ultimate selfhood in my mind, but what about all the in-between stuff? And I think that's what we're talking about here. Robin Williams said, with my ability to channel the many kinds of personas through my own work, I was fit for doing the kind of integration of my parts in the soul sense to help me include more selfhood than before. There were a lot of aspects to me. Each time I played a role in a movie, for example, some part of me was formed or shaped, and this became useful in my ability to include more soul, in a sense, after I became non-physical. So there's an integration that happens. He also says, I was a sensitive melancholic, and he's talking about his physical lifetime, who was not ever really able to transcend the suffering of the world. This was me then, and it's me now too. Why is it both now? Do you think that I would have abandoned this person because I've grown up to be the chairman of the board? And I forgot to mention that it's towards the end of the book, I think, because it's the second to the last chapter, he springs on all of us, and I hope I'm not spoiling the surprise. But he says that he's the chairman of the board who's been in charge of writing this whole book. Now, I'd have never known if he was being serious or not when he said that. So, but he's saying here that he is the chairman of the board. He says, and so now he's saying, this person who I was, would I have abandoned him to become the chairman of the board, to evolve, to transcend? No, because he's transcending and including. He said, no, that's the point here. I'm that way now too, only in another kind of realm where I have collected these wonderful attributes of selfhood. I can't be the chairman of the board without this sad little suicidal maniac who I was and love now more than anything, perhaps. I'm more than him, yet I'm still him too. What would your requirements be for a chairman of the board? Who would guide this kind of thing? Would you want them to be mean, cruel, or dishonest? No, you would want him to be like Robin was, kind, generous, suffering his own woes with dignity. He is and was somebody who you want in your corner. Therefore, he's also the chairman of the board. And J.D. Salinger speaks specifically about these being aspects. And giving us, in this passage, he also gives us encouragement about the world today. He describes this as, this has been the most treacherous time on earth, perhaps. This terrible feud between people has taken too many lives, and too much harm has come to those who fight against those who oppress others. This is not going to end anytime soon. However, it will get better soon. The reason why it will get better soon is because you're allowing more of your greater, more non-physical aspects of yourselves to come through you, so as to tend to your situations more easily and with less suffering. You have encouraged more selfhood by the very things you think about when you see yourselves as good. You allow more intentional actions. With each breath you take, you gain more love for self and the world. Do you see how the very things you're thinking now contribute to the beauty of the world? If you don't, you really should. And he goes on to say that this is about, this experience that we're having now is about your own savior self coming to rescue you, our own greater selves, you might also call them, I think. Jane Roberts, we want you to let go of any ideas you have about saviors needing to be persecuted or die suffering. These are not necessarily the ways to go if you will take on the idea of being a servant savior, not a heroic, damaging one, but a truly gifted, humble servant of the world. You don't need to die for your cause. You don't need to even give up your wealth. You only need to commit to doing everything you can to help the world, not at the expense of your own lives, but as providers of necessary things to others. Sacrifices will need to happen sometimes, but ultimately, you're better alive in the world than you are dead. So what Jane is implying too is that, you know, we really do have purpose here in the world. And she isn't the only author who encourages us to do good works in the world. So here are my takeaways. I got through those pretty quickly. So we go as we are and continue to create our own reality. Suicide will not prevent the important work of inner transformation. So if people think that they're going to avoid the inner work to resolve their physical, emotional, spiritual challenges, you know, they won't. We continue. Now we get help there, but we can get help here too, hopefully. There are suicide prevention hotlines. I give those, and I give that in the book. And so it's not an option. Suicide is not an option, because that's how important the inner work is for us. It's part of who we are as soul in transition. So it's wise to do the inner work now, the meditation, the practices, the belief practices, finding our intent and purpose, and so on. And connecting with our own inner selves, our greater selves. So we need to accept and love who we are and were, because they're an important part of our selfhood. As Robin says, you know, this suicidal maniac who he was is still important to this chairman of the board, who he is now. Consciousness is primary, and there are areas of consciousness that this I would call divine order, or Einstein in the book calls divine order, that keeps everything straight miraculously. It's amazing. Healing is provided and involves integration of our aspects. And some of us are doing that work now, even while we're physical. Carl Jung has, of course, a lot to say about aspects in his chapter, and how we are many kinds of self. And we're encouraged to connect with our greater self and be servant saviors in the world. And so many of them make a point of telling the reader that they want to help. They're here with us. We're with them now. And Jane calls them our best friends. Your very best friends are here to help you. You're with us now. Even though we can't see them, they're here to support us. It's just such a lovely thought. And I mean, I certainly feel that way. I feel in relationship, and I think that readers are going to feel in relationship too. So here's the book, Afterlives, Firsthand Accounts of 20 Notable People. It's available on Amazon. It should be everywhere, but if there's any problem getting it, you can contact me. I also want to mention that it makes a really great gift, because it puts it puts concepts into words that don't have a lot of scientific, and especially not a lot of New Age dogma attached to them. It really is for almost anyone who is open to the idea of an afterlife, and you know, and who may benefit from the wisdom therein, of course. So it's a spiritual book, but it's also a very undogmatic and accessible one. Seth Revealed, Unlock the Secrets of Conscious Creation is available on _demand.newworldview.com. That is the comprehensive on-demand course that you can go on your own pace to learn about the Seth information. And I will, in the fall, be offering a Find Your Intent and Purpose course, and I will make that available. Maybe I can come back at some point or share the link somehow. And you can also sign up for email updates at newworldview.com, and you can stay apprised of our efforts there. Chris Johnson, who's on this call, is my colleague, and also my husband, Paul Helfrich. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne. You've given us some really important insights, but I can assure the reader, the listeners rather, there are many more than you were able to talk about.
Okay.
And I find one of the most extraordinary chapters, partly because I'm so interested in him, is on Goethe, and what Goethe had to say about science, about being taken over by the materialistic concepts, and not incorporating the spiritual dimension. I mean, it's exactly the kind of thing you would expect him to say, and to get out into nature, to cultivate your sense of beauty. I mean, he did that all the time. And those are the sort of simple things which can enrich our lives immeasurably, just on a daily basis. And that's surely what this is about. I just want to make one remark before we have our break, and then we'll come back for announcements and discussion. And that is that a friend this morning sent me a clip from TikTok. I'm not sure who this man was, but the substance of it was that they showed a clip of an apocalyptic film, and the apocalyptic film said the world is going to end. There's nothing you can do about it, and she was able to fast forward to this kind of simulated end of the world, and she said, no, this has not happened yet. This has not happened yet. It doesn't need to happen. And then that was the end of the excerpt. And then his comment on this was that we are being fed almost incessant disaster headlines. You know, things are falling apart. Things are going to the dogs. Everything is disintegrating. And if we buy into that with our kind of co-creation capacity that we have, then we are actually helping bring about the very things that we're afraid of, and that of course is a principle, a law of attraction. So if we need to watch our diets in that respect, our diet, what we're ingesting, especially images from the media, and not buy into this collective doom-laden forecast, which is impregnated with fear. And his final sentence was, darkness, more darkness cannot overcome darkness. Only light can overcome darkness. And that was a kind of wonderful takeaway, which I think reinforces what you've been telling us this evening. So it's now 29, and so let's have a 5-minute break, and we'll come back at 34 for wherever you are. So 5-minute break.